The wrong door rain had been falling all morning, heavy and relentless, turning the streets into silver rivers that carried away fallen leaves and cigarette butts. Sundar sat in the back seat of a modest black sedan, his eyes fixed on the windshield wipers as they fought the storm in slow, rhythmic arcs. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday, one of those rare days where he could disappear from the noise of meetings, deadlines, and screens. But a phone call the night before had changed everything. It was from his old neighbor in Chennai, someone he hadn't heard from in decades. The voice had trembled as it spoke of a death, a mutual friend from his youth, someone Sundar vaguely remembered, a boy named Arjun who used to play cricket with them in the dusty courtyard between their houses. There was no family left in the city, the neighbor had said, so they were holding a small service in a quiet chapel in California, of all places. Sundar didn't ask how Arjun had ended up halfway across the world. All he knew was that he owed it to the past to show up, even if he had been just a distant figure in Arjun's story. He told his driver to drop him at St. Mary's Chapel, tucked away on a street he'd never noticed before. When the car stopped, Sundar stepped out into the cold wind and felt the rain instantly soak the shoulders of his dark suit. The chapel was old, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and a single bell that rang faintly as he pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candles and damp wood, and the light was soft, almost hesitant. People were already seated in neat rows of wooden pews dressed in black and gray. Sundar slipped in quietly, his head bowed in respect, and took a seat near the back. He scanned the faces, trying to find some fragment of familiarity, but none came. There was a large framed photograph near the altar. The man in it was smiling warmly, his eyes deep and kind. Sundar felt a small twist in his chest. The man looked nothing like the boy he remembered. Time, distance, and life had drawn their own story on his face. The service began with a hymn sung so softly that it seemed to float above them like a fragile thread. Then a woman in her 60s stepped up to the lectern, her voice breaking as she spoke of the man's generosity, his stubborn sense of justice, his way of giving without asking anything in return. Sundar listened, nodding politely, though every word felt oddly disconnected from the faint, cricket-playing memory of Arjun. He carried in his head that it wasn't until the next speaker, a young man in his 20s, that Sundar began to feel something shift. The man told a story of how the deceased had once pulled him out of a dark spiral, saving him from homelessness by giving him a place to stay and a job to get back on his feet. There were tears in his voice, but also laughter, as he described the little quirks and sayings the man was known for. Sundar's brow furrowed. None of these details matched the Arjun he thought he had come to mourn. The realization crept in slowly, almost reluctantly. This might not be Arjun at all. His heart began to pound in his chest, a strange heat creeping into his cheeks. Had he come to the wrong funeral? The idea seemed absurd. He shifted in his seat, looking more closely at the photograph again. The more he stared, the more certain he became. This was a stranger. He didn't know this man. He wasn't supposed to be here. His first instinct was to stand up quietly and leave. But something made him stay. Maybe it was the way the woman in the front row, clearly the widow, was gripping a crumpled tissue with trembling hands. Maybe it was the raw grief in the room, the kind that makes strangers feel like family, even if only for an hour. Maybe it was a curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't name yet. As the service continued, Sundar found himself listening more intently. The man they were honoring had been a teacher, a mentor, and a quiet activist who had helped dozens of struggling immigrants find work and housing. His life had been a patchwork of small kindnesses, stitched together without any desire for recognition. Sundar felt a strange pull in his chest, not just admiration, but something heavier. Here was a man who had left a trail of good in the world without the power of wealth or influence. Only the steady strength of his heart. When the final prayer ended, people began to rise and move toward the widow to offer their condolences. Sundar hesitated. What could he possibly say? He didn't know her. He hadn't known her husband. And yet, somehow, walking out without saying anything felt wrong. His feet carried him forward almost against his will. When he reached her, he spoke softly. I didn't know him well, he said, his voice catching slightly. But from everything I've heard today, I wish I had. The widow looked up at him, her eyes red but steady. You must be one of his old friends, she said. Hey, would have been glad you came. Sundar didn't correct her. Instead, he nodded, and for a brief moment, he felt the weight of a life he hadn't lived pressing against him. As he turned to leave, a man in the corner caught his eye, tall, thin, wearing a worn brown coat. He was watching Sundar closely, almost too closely, as if he knew something others didn't. When Sundar stepped outside into the rain, that same man followed him. You're Sundar Pichai, the man said quietly, his voice low and deliberate. He wanted to meet you before he died. Sundar froze, his breath catching in his throat. The words hung in the wet air between them. Impossible and unshakable ... the message left behind the rain hadn't let up. And Sundar could feel the cold seeping through his suit as he stood under the heavy gray sky, staring at the man in the brown coat. His voice still echoed in Sundar's mind. He wanted to meet you before he died. The weight of that statement pressed on Sundar like a hand on his chest, firm and unyielding. He didn't know this man. He wasn't even supposed to be here. Yet somehow the deceased had wanted to see him. I think you're mistaken, Sundar said slowly, choosing his words carefully, his breath misting in the damp air. I didn't know him. I came here by accident. The man's expression didn't change. His eyes were sharp, like he had been expecting that answer. Accident or not, he replied. You're here. Maybe that's not a coincidence. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small weathered envelope, its edges curled and darkened from age. He left this with me. Said if you ever came here, even by mistake, to give it to you. Sundar hesitated, his hand hovering before taking the envelope. It was thin, light, but something about it made his pulse quicken. The man didn't wait for a thank you. He simply gave a small nod and walked away. Blending into the line of black umbrellas moving down the sidewalk, Sundar stood there for a moment longer, the envelope cold in his hand before stepping toward his car. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror as he got in. Sir, back to the office? The man asked. Sundar paused. He should have said yes. There was work waiting, calls scheduled, emails piling up. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he heard himself say, no. Just drive. The car moved slowly through the wet streets, past shuttered shops and rain-slicked sidewalks. Sundar kept turning the envelope over in his hands. There was no name on the front, only 2 words in neat handwriting, for when it matters. The simplicity of it made his throat tighten. It felt like something from another time, before texts and emails had swallowed the world whole. He slipped a finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, its creases soft from being handled many times. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. Dear Sundar, if you're reading this, then something unlikely has happened. You found your way here. Maybe. By choice, maybe not. I don't know you, not personally. But I've followed your journey for years. I've watched the way you speak to people, the way you treat those with less power than you. I've seen you take moments in a room full of noise to listen to the quietest voice that mattered to me. Years ago, I was in a place where nothing made sense. I had no money, no home, and no one left to call family. One night, I stumbled across a talk you gave at a small university. You said something I'll never forget. You can't choose where you start, but you can choose where you go. It lit something in me, a small fire that refused to go out. I built my life from that fire. I always hoped to thank you in person. I didn't get the chance, but maybe fate has a different way of bringing people together. If you're willing, there's something I'd like you to do for me. It's in the box under my desk at the house. My wife knows which one. Please don't ignore this. It's important. Daniel Orr. Sundar read the letter twice, then a third time, each word sinking deeper. Daniel R., The name was unfamiliar, but the story was painfully clear. He wasn't here for Arjun at all. He had walked into Daniel's funeral, a man who claimed Sundar had unknowingly changed his life. The realization stirred something in him, a mixture of humility, unease, and an unshakable sense of obligation. The car slowed as they reached a red light. Sundar stared out at the blurred city through the rain-streaked glass. He thought about turning back, about handing the envelope to someone else, and washing his hands of the whole strange episode. But the words for when it matters kept echoing. In his mind, he gave the driver a new address, the widow's home, the one listed in the funeral program he'd picked up earlier. When they arrived, the house was small and modest, with a garden that must have been beautiful in better weather. The widow answered the door, her eyes still swollen, but her voice steady. "Mr. Pichai," she said softly, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I found something," Sundar replied, holding up the envelope. "He asked me to come here. Said you know about a box." She didn't look surprised. Instead, she stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. The house was warm and filled with the faint scent of fresh tea. She led him to a small study, at the back where an old wooden desk stood against the wall. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a plain cardboard box, sealed with tape. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that this box would go to you if you ever came. I didn't understand then. Maybe I still don't." She placed it in his hands. It was heavier than it looked. The tape was brittle, easy to peel away. Inside were 3 items: an old leather notebook, a small velvet pouch, and a folded piece of paper with a name and address written in blue ink. Before Sundar could ask about any of it, the widow's phone rang in the other room. She excused herself, leaving him alone with the box. He opened the notebook first. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, stories of people Daniel had helped over the years, strangers he'd given shelter to, young students he'd mentored, workers he defended when they were treated unfairly. Each story ended with a line in the margin. Small acts, big ripples. Sundar's fingers moved to the velvet pouch. Inside was an old silver key, worn smooth by time. He turned it over in his hand, wondering what door it might open, and then he unfolded the paper with the address. It was in a part of the city Sundar didn't recognize. But under the address, there were 5 words scrawled in haste. "Find her before they do." His pulse quickened. Who was her? More importantly, who were they? Behind him, the widow's voice called from the other room, asking if he'd like tea. Sundar slipped the key and paper into his jacket pocket, his mind already racing with possibilities. Whatever this was, it was no longer just a mistake. It was a path he had stepped onto without meaning to, and now there was no turning back. Asterisk, the girl no one knew Rain had eased into a fine mist by the time Sundar stepped back into the street. The city seemed quieter now, the sounds of tires hissing on wet asphalt and the distant hum of traffic fading into a soft background. He stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the paper in his pocket, the address burning in his mind. Find her before they do. The words were not just a warning. They felt like a countdown, an urgency he could almost hear ticking somewhere behind his ribs. Back in the car, Sundar gave the driver the address. The man glanced at him in the mirror with a hint of curiosity, but said nothing. They drove through parts of the city Sundar rarely visited. Narrow streets lined with aging apartment blocks. Their paint peeling, balconies sagging under the weight of rusted railings and forgotten laundry. It was the kind of neighborhood where life carried on quietly, unnoticed by those who lived in the glittering towers downtown as they pulled up to the building. Sundar noticed the lights in most of the windows were off, though it wasn't yet evening. The place had an air of neglect, but also of secrecy. The kind where people minded their own business because it was safer that way. He stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter against the damp air, and made his way to the front door. It was locked, but the silver key in his pocket felt warm, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. The lock turned smoothly. The hallway inside was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The smell of dust and Something faintly metallic hung in the air. He climbed the creaking stairs, following the numbers painted on the doors until he reached the one from the note. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, the old instinct to knock, battling the strange feeling that he shouldn't announce himself. Instead, he turned the key. The door opened into a small apartment. It was neat, almost too neat, as if someone had been careful to erase any trace of themselves. A worn sofa sat against the wall, a few books stacked on a coffee table, and a single framed photograph on a shelf. The photo showed a young girl, maybe 15, her hair falling over one eye, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her gaze. Sundar's stomach tightened. Was this her? A soft sound from the kitchen made him turn sharply. There, half hidden behind the counter, stood the girl from the photo. She froze when she saw him, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like she was ready to run. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low but steady. Sundar raised his hands slightly, palms open. "My name is Sundar," he said gently. "I came here because of Daniel." At the mention of the name, her grip on the counter loosened just a fraction. "You knew him?" "Not exactly," Sundar admitted. "But he left me something?" "A note. It said to find you, before they do." Her face paled, and for a moment she just stared at him, like she was weighing whether to believe him or throw him out. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "He said this might happen." She disappeared into the bedroom and came back holding a small backpack. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice now trembling. "If you found me, they will too." "And they're faster than you think?" Sundar felt a ripple of unease. "Who are they?" She hesitated, glancing at the door like she expected it to burst open at any moment. "People who wanted something from Daniel, something he wouldn't give them. Now they think I have it." He wanted to ask more, but the sharp sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, heavy and unhurried. The girl's eyes widened in panic. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward the back of the apartment. There was a narrow fire escape. Beyond the window, "We have to go," she hissed. Sundar followed her down the slick metal stairs, the cold air stinging his face. They reached the alley just as a black sedan turned onto the street. He didn't recognize the men inside, but their eyes swept the building with the precision of people who already knew what they were looking for. The girl tugged him into a side street, her pace quick and urgent. "You shouldn't be here," she said, breathing hard. "But if Daniel sent you, it means you're the only one he trusted." "Trusted with what?" Sundar asked. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "With the truth. And the truth could get both of us killed." The truth they wanted buried. Girl's words hung in the air like frost, sharp and cold, as they hurried down the narrow street. Sundar's mind was racing, but his instincts told him to stay quiet. There would be time for questions later, but right now, their footsteps needed to be the only sound. They weaved between old brick buildings until they reached a small public park, the kind that looked forgotten by the city, with rusted swings swaying in a damp wind and patches of grass worn down to bare mud. She led him to a bench under the shadow of a gnarled tree, her breath still uneven. "My name is Emma," she said finally, her voice low. "Daniel wasn't my father by blood. He saved me. Twice." Sundar listened closely. The rain soaked. World around them fading. "The first time was years ago," she continued, her gaze fixed on the wet ground. "I was 12. My mother had... Well, she had her own battles, and she lost them. I ended up in a shelter. It was one of those places people pass by without noticing, because they don't want to see the truth. Daniel volunteered there. He saw me trying to fix an old computer one day, and instead of telling me to stop, he taught me how to make it work again. He brought me books, showed me how to code, made me believe I was worth something." Her voice faltered for a moment. "But that wasn't why they came after him?" She glanced around, scanning the park for anyone watching. Sundar leaned forward slightly. "Who are they, Emma?" She met his eyes then, and for the first time, Sundar saw how much fear she was holding behind that steady tone. "A company. At least that's what they looked like on the surface. They called themselves Nexera, They came into the neighborhood offering jobs, cheap housing, loans. It sounded good, too good. Daniel started digging, and he found out they were using it all as a front to exploit immigrants. Fake contracts, taking their wages, making them work under threats. He couldn't prove it in court, but he had evidence. They knew it. A cold wind moved through the park, making the swings groan on their chains. Sundar felt his jaw tighten. And now they think you have that evidence? Emma nodded. After he died, I came back to the apartment. The place had been searched, drawers pulled out, files gone. But they didn't find what they were looking for. Daniel never told me where it was. He just said, if something happened to him, someone would come for me, and they'd help finish what he started. He meant me, Sundar said quietly. It wasn't a question. Emma's eyes softened, but only slightly. If you really are who he trusted, then yes. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small flash drive, sealed in a plastic case. This is all I have. It's encrypted. Daniel gave it to me weeks ago, but told me never to plug it in, unless I was ready for my life to change. I don't know what's on it, but if it's enough to bring down Nexera, they won't stop coming. Sundar took the flash drive in his hand. It was light, almost weightless, but it carried the heaviness of responsibility. He could have walked away right then, told himself it wasn't his fight. But he remembered Daniel's letter, the line about small acts making big ripples. And he realized this was one of those moments where doing nothing would be the loudest choice of all. Before he could speak, movement caught his eye. A man was standing just beyond the park's fence, pretending to check his phone, but looking at them too often. His build, his stance, Sundar recognized the type. Not a casual passerby. Emma noticed him too. We have to move, she whispered. They left the park quickly, keeping to the narrowest streets, slipping through small shops to lose any potential tail. By the time they reached a quieter block, Sundar could feel the pulse in his neck pounding. He had never been in a situation like this. His life was usually meetings, decisions, carefully calculated risks. This was different, raw, unpredictable. Emma finally stopped outside a small, weathered church with a faded red door. This is where Daniel brought people when they had nowhere else to go, she said. The pastor here. He's one of the few we can trust. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the faint scent of old wood and candle wax. The pastor, a gentle man in his 70s, welcomed them without surprise, as though he had been expecting them. He led them to a small room at the back. Closing the door firmly, Emma placed the flash drive on the table. We need to know what's on this. The pastor shook his head. Not here. Too risky. Daniel told me if it ever came to this, there's a safe place in the hills, far from the city. You'll need to take her there. And Sundar. His voice lowered. Once you see what's on it, you'll understand why Daniel didn't go to the police. Sundar felt the weight of those words settle over him. Before he could ask more, the church's front door slammed open. Voices, deep, commanding, carried down the hallway. Heavy footsteps followed. The pastor's eyes sharpened. Go, now, through the side door. Don't look back. Emma grabbed her backpack. Sundar pocketed the flash drive. They slipped out the side, just as a shadow crossed the doorway behind them. And in that moment, Sundar realized whatever Daniel had uncovered. It was big enough to make dangerous people desperate. Asterisk the road into silence. Night had settled in like a thick blanket, heavy and muffling the world beyond the narrow alley behind the church. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still carried its damp chill, clinging to their clothes and hair. Sundar and Emma moved quickly, their footsteps soft against the wet pavement. The side streets were quiet, but Sundar couldn't shake the feeling of eyes somewhere in the dark, watching from behind drawn curtains or unlit windows. They reached a small car the pastor had arranged for them, an old hatchback with peeling paint and a faint smell of gasoline inside. The keys were already in the ignition. Emma slid into the passenger seat, clutching her backpack against her chest as if it were armor. Sundar started the engine, and the low rumble sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. The pastor had given them simple instructions. Head north. Stay off the main roads and avoid places where people might recognize Sundar. His face was too familiar, too easy to remember, and they didn't know who in the city might already be in Nextra's pocket dot for the first half hour. They drove in silence. The city's lights faded behind them, replaced by the dim glow of scattered street lamps and the endless black stretch of rural roads. Sundar could feel Emma's tension beside him, not just fear, but a constant readiness to react, like a spring wound tight. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, even when he was already checking it. Do you trust this pastor? Sundar asked finally. Keeping his voice low, Emma hesitated. I think Daniel did, and that's enough for me. She looked out the window for a moment before adding, but trust doesn't mean safety. It just means we've got fewer people to worry about, maybe. He nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. Trust, in this kind of situation, was fragile, a choice you kept making over and over. Never quite certain if it was the right one. After nearly an hour of winding through dark, narrow roads, Emma broke the silence. You didn't know, Daniel, she said quietly. So why are you still here? You could have walked away at the funeral. No one would have blamed you. Sundar thought about that for a long moment. Because he believed in something, and because I've been given a lot in life. Opportunities, a platform, people who will listen when I speak. Sometimes that means you don't get to walk away, even if it's not your fight. Emma studied him for a moment, and there was something in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and the smallest flicker of relief, before she turned back to the window. The road began to climb, leading them into the low hills outside the city. The darkness felt thicker here, the kind that swallowed the edges of the road and made the headlights seem too small. The air grew colder, and the sound of the wind against the car was the only reminder they were still moving forward. Sundar's mind kept returning to the flash drive in his pocket. It was absurd that something so small could hold the key to so much chaos. He wondered what Daniel had uncovered that couldn't be taken to the police, what truth was dangerous enough to keep hidden, yet important enough to risk his life. For around midnight, they pulled off onto a dirt road, barely visible except for the wooden post marking the turn. The pastor had described the safe house as an old caretaker's cabin on abandoned farmland. As they drove deeper into the darkness, the road narrowed until it was more trail than path. Finally, the headlights caught the small wooden structure, slouched slightly with age but still standing. Emma got out first, scanning the shadows before motioning for Sundar to follow. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, the air dry and warmer than he expected. There was a single oil lamp on the table, casting long shadows across the walls. No electricity, Emma said. Daniel said it was safer that way. No signals. No eyes on us, unless they're here in person. Sundar set his jacket over a chair and finally took the flash drive out of his pocket, placing it on the table between them. It seemed to glow, faintly in the lamplight, its plastic casing catching the flicker of the flame. Emma watched it like someone might watch a door they weren't sure they wanted to open. Once we see what's on it, we can't unsee it, she said. And they'll know we know. Sundar's fingers lingered on the drive. Then we'd better be ready. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, battered laptop. This doesn't connect to anything, she explained. No Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, nothing. Daniel kept it for work he didn't want online. As she inserted the drive, the old machine hummed to life, its screen glowing faintly in the dim cabin. Folders appeared, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and short cryptic phrases. Emma opened the first folder. Inside were scanned documents, contracts with signatures, lists of names, financial transfers that stretched into millions. The deeper they went, the worse it became. Evidence of human trafficking disguised as job recruitment. Fake housing agreements that left families in debt they could never repay. Photos of workers living in inhumane conditions. Sundar felt a heaviness in his chest, a mixture of anger and disbelief. This is enough to destroy them, he said. If we can get it out, Emma replied. Daniel said Nextra has people in law enforcement and the courts. This can't just be. dropped in the wrong hands. It has to go somewhere they can't bury it. Before Sundar could respond, a noise cut through the stillness, faint but unmistakable. Gravel crunching under tires outside. Emma's eyes snapped to his. "We didn't leave any lights on outside," she whispered. The sound grew louder. Closer, then the low murmur of voices. Sundar's pulse spiked. Whoever was out there had found them. The choice that changes everything. The sound outside was no longer faint. It was deliberate. Slow, crunching footsteps across the gravel. The kind of steps taken by people who didn't need to rush because they believed they had already won. The cabin, which had felt like a safe haven only minutes before, now felt too small, too still. The lamplight seemed louder somehow, the shadows heavier. Sundar glanced at Emma, and in her eyes he saw the truth neither of them needed to say. Whoever had found them wasn't here to talk. Emma closed the laptop with a soft click and slid it into her backpack, tucking the flash drive deep into an inner pocket. "We can't let them take this," she whispered, her voice steady but tight. "Daniel died for it." Sundar moved toward the single window, careful to stay low. Outside, the moonlight caught the shape of two figures by the front of the cabin, their faces obscured by the brims of dark caps. Another shadow moved along the side wall. They were surrounding the place. "There's a back door," Emma mouthed. But before they could move, the front door rattled under a heavy knock. Not frantic, but firm. A man's voice followed, deep and calm, with a faint edge that curled around the words like smoke. "We don't want trouble," he called. "Just give us what Daniel left, and we'll be on our way." Emma's hand gripped Sundar's arm, hard enough to hurt. Sundar felt something rising in him. Not just fear, but a strange clarity. He thought of Daniel's letter, of the widow's quiet strength, of the people in those scanned photos who had no voice. Walking. The way was no longer an option, not without betraying everything Daniel had stood for. The knocking came again, harder this time. "You've got 10 seconds. Emma's eyes darted to the back door again, but Sundar shook his head. "If we run now, they'll just follow. We need to make this count." He pulled out his phone, the one he hadn't used all day for fear of being tracked, and opened a secure messaging app. It took him less than a minute to send the entire contents of the flash drive to 3 people he knew could make noise the moment it hit their inbox. An investigative journalist he trusted, a human rights lawyer in London, and a small nonprofit in India that specialized in exposing corporate abuse. As the files began to upload, the front door shook violently. The wood groaned under the pressure. Emma's breath came quick now, but her eyes stayed locked on the phone screen as the progress bar crawled forward. 70%, 80-5, 90-8. When the bar finally turned green, Sundar's chest loosened, but only slightly. He deleted the app, smashed the phone against the table's edge until it cracked, and shoved the pieces into the cold ash of the fireplace. "Now we move," he said. They slipped through the back door into the dark, the cold air wrapping around. Then, like a warning, the hills behind the cabin were steep, their slopes littered with rocks and twisted roots. Sundar kept low, following Emma as they moved uphill, their shoes crunching softly on the damp earth. Below, the cabin's front door finally gave way with a splintering crack, followed by angry shouts. They climbed until their legs burned, finally dropping behind a ridge that kept them hidden from view. From there, they could see faint beams of light sweeping the area, flashlights moving through the trees. Searching, Emma leaned against a boulder, her breath visible in the cold night. "Do you think they'll stop now?" Sundar shook his head. "Not tonight, maybe not for a while. But it's already too late for them. The truth is out." They stayed there until the beams of light faded, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the grass. When they finally made their way down the other side of the hill, dawn was just beginning to push against the horizon. In the pale light of morning, they reached a small roadside inn. The owner, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, didn't ask questions when Sundar paid for a room in cash. Inside, Emma set the backpack down and sat on the bed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the last 24 hours. Daniel used to say fate isn't about where you end up, She murmured. It's about who you become along the way. Sundar sat across from her, letting the words settle between them. Then maybe this was fate, he said quietly. I wasn't supposed to be at that funeral, but I was, and now maybe we're exactly where we need to be. Emma managed a small smile, the first real one he had seen from her. Outside, the sun was climbing, washing the hills in gold. Somewhere far away, files were already being read, the evidence being prepared for the world to see. The fight wasn't over. But the silence had been broken. And in that moment, Sundar understood something Daniel must have always known. That sometimes you don't get to choose the battles that find you. But you can choose to stand *,